What was the first thing in my mailbox yesterday morning? It was an emergency message. I'm in the country. It was an emergency message from my neighbour in central London. Don't return home. This is Bloomsbury. This is 100 yards south of the British Museum. 2 boys were stabbed, small hours of this morning, beginning in Bloomsbury Square, where there is a statue of Charles James Fox erected by the Duke of Bedford.
So obviously you've been quite pessimistic in the past about the state of the country, but there are some people who are incredibly optimistic. Fraser Nelson, a columnist for The Times, has been leading the charge of this optimistic brigade. He said recently in his Times column, "It becomes impossible to believe what the facts do seem to suggest, that our society, for all its faults, is probably safer, richer and better than any before it. Today, progress is the truth that dare not speak its name. Major environmental and social achievements are barely known, and when mentioned, universally disbelieved." What do you make of Fraser's argument?
Well, back in the 18th century, there's a very famous novel by Voltaire called Candide, in which there is a gentleman almost as learned as Fraser Nelson called Pangloss. And Pangloss believes that everything is for the best in the best of all possible worlds. And he will explain away earthquakes, plagues, disasters, all as part of God's big plan. All that dear Fraser has done is replace God with progress. And he's been, and obviously, what Voltaire is doing is satirizing. It's made into, it's actually made into an opera in America of all places, which is the great bedrock of progress. But the problem is, Voltaire was wise enough to realize that progress doesn't go on an even front. You can have, who none of us would deny, it would be insane to deny that health is better than it's ever been, that the levels of general comfort, I mean, I just look at the contrast between the world I was born in, that I grew up in. The obvious one is the sheer domestic comfort. The house that I was born in, which was regarded as an improved working class dwelling. I was born in 45, it was 10 years old. It had a single source of heat, which was a coal fire in the sitting room, the living room, everything room, that burned straight through into the kitchen, into a range. Everything was filthy with coal dust. Of course it was. I remember the appalling task of my mother, a house-proud woman, having to clean this thing. You looked like a coal miner when you'd finished it. I remember my bedroom, 1/2 inch of ice on the inside of the window. There was one fireplace upstairs in the main bedroom, which was never burned in the 30 years. Well, how long my parents were there? They were there 50 years. That fireplace was never lit. There was no heating in the bathroom. There was no sink in the bathroom. There was a single sink in the kitchen. That's an improved working class dwelling. 1 electric point. 1. Now, of course then, there's been staggering material progress. But the idea that human progress goes on this even front is childish. You have development in one area, and you can have either stalling or actual regression in other areas. That if one looks, for example, at the kind of area we're talking about, how a society functions, that thing which I hope we all believe in, which is freedom, self-government, that peculiar balance between controlling yourself and being free. Because freedom cannot mean license, otherwise you trespass on others. So it means an extraordinary, delicate balance of relations. It's not simply the enunciated doctrine of rights. Rights, remember, represent a kind of state of nature in which my right is in conflict with your right, as we see very clearly. So what I think has happened alongside that material progress is a very large measure of social disintegration. And this, by the way, as always, you know, the arts anticipate this. There's a wonderful Michael Frayn novel, and I can't now remember its title, which is written 30, 40 years ago, which is a version of The Economist, private affluence, public squalor. What I've been talking about is private affluence. And the idea of the novel is the rich live naked in these exquisitely furnished, beautifully appointed, air-conditioned, gently heated, perfectly scented, wonderfully cushioned homes. Then outside, well, a bit like central London. I mean, shall I stop being anecdotal? What was the first thing in my mailbox yesterday morning? It was an emergency message. I'm in the country. It was an emergency message from my neighbour in central London. Don't return home. This is Bloomsbury. This is 100 yards south of the British Museum. 2 boys were stabbed, small hours of this morning, beginning in Bloomsbury Square, where there is a statue of Charles James Fox erected by the Duke of Bedford. And the struggle had spilled out the whole of the way along Bloomsbury Way. The entire neighbourhood was shut down. Bloomsbury? So again, the problem with Nelson, Fraser Nelson, if you actually look at his use of statistics, you will remember somebody who was almost as clever as Voltaire. That's to say, Disraeli coins the phrase lies, damn lies, and statistics. Crime statistics usually rather like military tactics. You know, there's a wonderful saying, generals are always fighting the last war. Statistics always represent the world before yesterday. And he points out that, for example, there's been a significant diminution of burglary. Far fewer crimes in houses. There's a very good reason for this. When I moved into this house, my country house where I'm sitting now, I found every window had bars, there were massive bolts. Why? Because in the 1980s and the 1990s, antique furniture was staggeringly valuable. My neighbour told me gypsies, dare I use the word, had twice broken into the house, and they'd even carried off a grandfather clock. Do you know how much a grandfather clock of good quality is worth nowadays? £100. And there's been this collapse. People used, young man, to steal television sets. The idea you'd bother carrying a television is so much easier to shoplift it anyway, that you bother carrying a television set. Do you see what I mean? That on the other hand, we're now going around with tiny little things like this in our hands that cost £800 or whatever it is, or wearing that, which, if it's not this one but my best one, is about £20,000. Therefore, what do thieves go for? They go for that. So the crime statistics represent the day before yesterday, and they completely fail to take account of highly specific, highly visible crimes, which of course is what we're now seeing, the stabbing that I described in Bloomsbury Way yesterday, the extraordinary high incidence of black-on-black stabbing. I mean, the black population of London, it's higher than the national average. I doubt if it's more than 10%. If you look at knife crime, both in terms of the victim and the perpetrator, it is between 45 and 55% black. Very similar pattern in America. I think, in fact, probably higher. And again, the general disintegration of the public sphere, going back to the Michael Frayn novel, that we have had a long period of slow, in my view, again, I am a conservative, but the catastrophic decision of the Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 2010 coalition government, George Osborne, to introduce austerity, which meant salami slicing all forms of state expenditure, with 2 exceptions: the NHS, sort of fine, and madly foreign aid. And the result is that you get a progressive deterioration of every aspect of the state-funded public sphere, be it hospitals, be it the NHS, be it schools, be it particularly local government, where there's been an enormous reduction in funding, coupled with, of course, the catastrophic decision to prioritise two areas entirely irrelevant to local government. One is the care of the elderly, those elderly who've got to go into care homes, and on the other hand, the so-called special educational needs, the SEND business, where we have the ludicrous position, again because you give children rights. A child that has a SEND order has the absolute right to personalised transport to school. This can cost £100,000 per child per year. So what we've done is to see this extraordinary disintegration of the public sphere, the general shabbiness, the decision of the police, of course, to prioritise specific types of crime, to go because the state that we have, which wishes to purvey and maintain and enforce the kind of myths. I mean, again, let's be blunt about Fraser Nelson. He is purveying a myth. Can we just be quite clear on this? We now have a state, like the late Russian state, like the late Soviet state, that rests, or indeed 1984, that rests on the purveying of myths. We believe in progress. We believe in human rights. We believe in climate change, climate mitigation. All of these things, they are one way or another. We believe, of course, in diversity. We believe in the wonders of multiculturalism. All of these things, they are enforced by, on the one hand, false statistics, allegedly demonstrating that a diverse board of directors makes a company better. There isn't a scrap of evidence, not a single item of evidence that this is true, but that we are required to believe it. And so there is propaganda like Nelson's, and on the other hand, there is, I'm afraid, the deliberate repression of both opinion and evidence to the contrary. Look at the effort that it's taken to get statistics about the let me get my word right, the race, let's use that word, of criminal suspects. And there's been in other words, there's been one of the reasons, again, why we cannot, even with a better conscience, I think, than somebody like Nelson, we can believe them, is because we know there's been such a deliberate suppression and distortion of information put in the public sphere in the name of these noble lies.
So his argument is that there's a sort of false consciousness amongst the British population that people have been indoctrinated by the internet, by videos online, by Twitter, by scaremongers, people like Nigel Farage who talk about lawless Britain. Whereas in actual fact, like he says, the statistics show that crime has massively decreased in the last 20 years. So what do you make of this argument again, that this is about vibes? I know Fraser Nelson, he did an interview about 10 years ago. So he says in this interview that we should address voters' concerns about immigration only on the rhetorical side of things. So basically say, look, we understand what you're thinking, we understand you have concerns, but when it comes to policy, essentially ignore those concerns. So he is very much a man who believes in, I suppose,
the noble lie. He believes in state propaganda. Let's actually look at what this is saying. This is saying we have a nominal thing called a democracy. The electorate, however, is so stupid that it cannot perceive reality from fiction. Can I tell you somebody else who believed in this view? It's called Plato. The person who believes in government by experts and that ordinary people are too stupid comes up with a very interesting formula. In the Republic, in Plato's Republic, there is the myth, the analogy of the cave. He says that most people cannot actually understand reality. If you think of the average, ordinary, uneducated, non-ex-editor of The Spectator, non-Times columnist person, this, inferior beast to whom democracy mistakenly gave the vote, think of them, they are, and it's a wonderful analogy. He says, think of them. They're imprisoned in a cave. It's the myth of the cave. All that they can see, they're tied down in their seats, all they can see is a white wall in front of them. Imagine puppets are being moved and there is a fire burning. And so what you do is you get the light, you get the shadow, the hugely enlarged shadow of the puppets on the wall. That, he says, is the ordinary person's view of reality. What does it sound like? It sounds like what you and I are doing now. It sounds like the internet. And Plato believed that people are fools and are manipulated by what they see. Fraser believes exactly the same thing. He also, of course, isn't it odd, while saying how terrible all this is, that he attributes such vast power to it? I mean, I am struck, all of these people, of course, regard somebody like Nigel Farage with infinite contempt. But they ascribe staggering power to him. Apparently, Nigel Farage is so amazing as a communicator. He dwarfs Churchill, you know. Nigel's only got to open his lips, and 50 million fools say that's the truth. I do not think that Mr. Nelson's arguments stand up to very much scrutiny, do they? I've been presenting a case which is broad, a case that shifts from an experience in Bloomsbury yesterday to the serious political critique of this kind of argument, pointing out, of course, it's not new. It is the argument of the dictator throughout the ages. The arguments Nelson is advancing are the arguments that produce, it's fascinating. He claims to be the liberal. He is advancing the arguments of the closed society. He is advancing the arguments of public lies, of public controlled discourse, of propaganda. He's a direct pupil of Machiavelli on the one hand, and much more directly, Alistair Campbell. The fathers of lies. They are the ones who tried to govern by lies. And what's going on at the moment is their lies are being found out, which is why the new media are so important. Why, I would argue, the most important event of the early 21st century is the decision of Elon Musk to break exactly the right-thinking Fraser Nelson monopoly on Twitter. That is the only reason Trump was elected. That, I think, is the only reason that there is a chance of breaking this leftish, soi-disant, actually very illiberal hold on our society. And we've got to understand that. I mean, what is going on suddenly is a non-controlled discourse, which is why Blue Sky, which is why the left hate it as much as they do, why they seek to control it, why there is going to be this increasing schism in the West between, unfortunately, states like us, where people like Fraser Nelson are dominant, and America, where people like J.D. Vance are for the moment.
Okay, I want to ask about the police. There's two incidences that have happened recently, which I think I'd love to get your reflection on. So the first is, this was a shopkeeper in London who had a sign on his
scumbags,
calling shoplifters scumbags. Obviously,
their feelings. Their feelings. How could he?
And the police said that this was offensive and told him to take down the sign. So that's number one. Number two, we have these two female police officers. They went out jogging, and their intent was to try and get men to catcall them and then arrest them for catcalling. What do you make of these two incidences?
I think they fit perfectly with the pattern that I've just been talking about. And this is what has gone so wrong. If rather than, and here is this man, if I remember correctly, the scumbag chap, had actually caught a scumbag red-handed, and the police had shown absolutely no interest in it whatever. And therefore, what he's doing, of course, is venting an absolutely justifiable rage. And if, again, I go back to what Nelson was saying, he doesn't seem to think that maybe people's perception of reality bears some sort of resemblance, do you know what, to what they actually experienced. This is once again, let's push back against all of this. There is that marvelous phrase in Brave New World, in 1984, which says that the most important injunction of the party was not to believe your own eyes. You had to see as you were told to see. You had to talk as you were supposed to talk. In other words, again, one of the most important things in 1984 is the control of language, that essay at the end on Newspeak. One of the principal activities that all of the people that Winston, indeed, the bit of the state that Winston moves in, is the Ministry of Truth. And what they're all doing is editing language, so the language itself will not permit you to say anything that is an state unacceptable thought. And what the police are doing with that poor shopkeeper is very crudely, because I'm afraid they do lack the intelligence of the state of 1984. They're very crudely trying to enforce a particular kind of language. There was another extraordinary incident in which a decorated policeman is sacked for not showing sufficient respect to a violent criminal when he arrests him. What? What? And the idea that when you are dealing with a genuine crime wave in London, nobody can deny the crime wave of stabbing or phone theft or ticket cheating or shoplifting, that you waste time trying to encourage a group of, okay, maybe thuggish men to go, look at that. I mean, what terrible injury is performed? Many women that I know say they rather enjoy it, that a clever woman knows exactly how to deal with that sort of behaviour, and to usually highly effectively put down the ass doing it. Again, it's this totally... What's gone wrong is that we've now got laws that are designed not to punish crime, but to change behaviour. Not laws that are designed to administer justice, but to change society. This is wholly inappropriate. That is not the purpose of the state. That is not the purpose of law. But of course, it's what goes on in dictatorships. But all of these things are, or should be, totally inimical to a free society, to a free people. The idea of the freeborn Englishman is one of the oldest tropes in our political culture. It goes back to the 15th century, particularly powerful in the 18th and 19th. The fact that we have a political class that throws it away, that we have the nudge unit, that we have the behavioural units. Of course, all of this reaching its hideous culmination in COVID. If you want the equivalent of Plato's cave, the myth, the incident that encompasses everything that's gone wrong in the 21st century, I would argue, since 1997, it is COVID. Every single thing in the state's reaction to COVID exemplifies all of this. The lies, the myth, the fact that it's essential to wear a mask, the whole notion of lockdown, the absolute catastrophe of the public finances, the prostitution of the NHS, which becomes just a national COVID service, the destruction of the education of 3 or 4 generations of school children, the terrible rewards that we're reaping. All of that is the quintessence of this monster state that we've created.
It's a kind of anarcho-tyranny. And there's a great example of this recently where a man on a tube was naked in front of children and the British passengers threw him off the tube. And now the police...
Can I say, I become an addict of this kind of thing. You're not describing the incident very well. One man comes up to him, and it's a crowded train, district line train, if I remember correctly, and the man comes up to him and tells him, in rather crude fashion, to pull his trousers up, whereupon there is the usual huge ranting and waving himself around, at which point other men pile in, and he's knocked around a bit. He had taken his belt off. His belt is then used to tie him down, and he's fairly roughly put off the train. At which point our wonderful police force, by the way, he's clearly mentally ill, and he's carted off to a mental hospital. At which point our wonderful police force announced that they are now searching for the perpetrators of this assault on him. Thanks to Foucault on the one hand, and do you know who? Enoch Powell on the other, the decision is to taken. In other words, Foucault arguing that mental illness is just a social construct, and Enoch Powell keen to save money. You shut down, when he's Secretary of State for Health, you shut down the long-term mental hospitals that were magnificent Victorian institutions. They were, some of them, I know a little bit about them from my own experience, because my poor mother finished in one of them for considerable stretches of time. They were physically very beautiful. Inside, it was sometimes less so, but they were not built as objects of cruelty. They were built as opportunities for healing, hence the fact they were situated in magnificent countryside and so on. But we decided we didn't want them. So again, the freedom to be homeless. Now, so one of the reasons is that we have stopped. And you asked about progress. When I was a young man, begging was illegal. There was no homelessness. It simply was not allowed. It was not allowed. If you tried sleeping rough, you were shoved in the cells overnight. In those days, there was actually police accommodation. If you were mentally sick, you were sectioned. And you were sectioned quickly. So the state was properly interventionist in this area. Now, on the contrary, in the name of a false liberalism and an equally false economy, the twin sins of right and left, you leave these people wandering around. And at the same time, you have virtually no presence of the state. We hardly have bobbies on the street anymore. The only time you will ever see a guard on the train is if he's checking tickets. That will be the only time. And otherwise they lock themselves away deliberately to avoid that. So you're in this extraordinary world in which I think it's astonishing, and it's a testimony to still the fundamental strength of British society, that public behaviour remains as relatively ordered as it is. But we're increasingly stretching those bonds. The small platoons are increasingly being nibbled away at. The bonds of society are being stretched to breaking point, and we're offering no help. And when, of course, people do try to self-help, the state suddenly becomes very jealous. You see, there is one of the elements of the social contract. Remember, we are very peculiar. If you look at Britain, we have one of the lowest ratios of weapons to population in the world. We are a genuinely disarmed society, apart, unfortunately, from knives. But as it were, completely the opposite. I think we have less than 5 guns per 100 people. America has 120. Have I got that right, or is it per 1,000? I think, but those are the orders of magnitude. America's got more guns than people. We have this tiny percent, but there's a precondition for that. If the state, and remember, this is in defiance of the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights gives us, just like the American Bill of Rights, the right to carry arms. The precondition for surrendering that right should be a state which aggressively protects the citizen. If the citizen demands a monopoly of force and is jealous in enforcing that, then he has got to protect the citizen. Otherwise, inevitably, there will be vigilantism. Inevitably, there will be the sort of scenes that we saw on that train, and they will be, I'm afraid, even rougher. And once again, what does this smack of? It smacks of Northern Ireland. It smacks of gang justice. And this is hideous. This is hideous.
You mentioned America. America has written, or the American government, I should say, have written a report recently about the state of human rights in Britain, and they have been very critical of our policies on particularly freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and so on. When you go around the world and you meet people, I mean, I live in America, Britain's reputation, I think, has plummeted when you meet people talk about the UK. I was in Georgia, not the state, but the country in the Caucasus, and people there were like, what have you done? Why have you let these people into your country? You know, it's just an extraordinary state of affairs. What do you think of Britain's international reputation today as compared with, say, in the 1970s when we were the so-called sick man of Europe?
I think we've simply gone full circle, haven't we? I mean, in the 1970s, the arguments were about the mismanagement of our economy, the quality of our industry, the state of our public finances, about nothing else. What's happened now, of course, is that many of the arguments about the state of our public finances, about deindustrialization, have come back. But there is this broader issue of societal disintegration, but also the remarkable shift in the behavior of the British state. What we're really talking about is a shift in what the state thinks it should do and what the state thinks it shouldn't do. You will be aware the argument that I put forward addresses this. My big political argument is called the Great Repeal and Restoration. My argument is that from 1997 onwards, there was a deliberate attempt at changing the nature of the British state. Broadly speaking, up to the 1990s, if you looked at things like freedom of speech, it was probably, despite the fact there weren't the formal provisions of the First Amendment, it was at least as well exercised in Britain as in America. It's in Britain, for example, that the great satirical wave, you're asking me about my experience, one of the things that changed my mind, changed how I think, how I behaved and whatever, was the great advent of satire in the 1960s, which that was the week that was, Germaine Greer and all that lot. I never thought that I would finish up being a friendly acquaintance of Germaine Greer, how one's life takes one. But I was a sixth former when that hit. And of course, it made anything that went on in America look unbelievably old-fashioned, fuddy-duddy, stitched up and whatever. And slowly, from the 1997, the shutters come down on England. And it's everything, our conversation is going in a full circle. The shutters come down because people like Fraser Nelson think that stupid people shouldn't be able to call things by their proper names, shouldn't be able to act on what they see, what they feel, and they suffer. And that instead, like Plato, they should sit in a cave and they should have a Lux-Wash version of reality played in front of them and press their little vote, because of course it won't be allowed to do anything like put a cross on a sheet of paper, far too difficult for them. They will press their finger on the appropriate yes button when they're told to and receive the little signal telling them to. That's the problem. And it is, I think, an infinite tragedy. And why are Americans so shocked? Why does J.D. Vance, interestingly enough, holidaying in England, where of course he's in the Cotswolds, he was at Chevening. So much of England is still staggeringly beautiful. And what we've got to remember, Stephen, is England invents America. Quite simply. The Constitution of America is a very lightly modified version of the Constitution of 18th century England. The reason why the American Revolution is the only successful revolution is because it wasn't a revolution. It's a rebellion. It's a revolt against colonial rule. And those men had the values of Englishmen. The greatest Englishman of the day, Edmund Burke, says that in his great address to the American people. Your fellow Englishmen. What you were doing is what we did. You embody the same values of freedom that we do. And the problem is, of course, we've lost them. Or rather, that implies, it just sort of happened, didn't it? No, they were taken away. They were taken away by Blair, by Campbell, by people like Fraser Nelson, all, of course, please, I mustn't abuse them, acting for the very best of possible intentions. Because, of course, Stephen, they knew better. They had better understanding. They were superior. They were experts. They were the philosopher kings. They, of course, in Blair's case, saw God. And so what we've got now is people like Vance correctly point out that what we have done, we began by talking about progress. Vance says you've regressed. You've gone backwards. And it seems to me to be manifestly the case that we have. But we've also, of course, shifted geographically. Again, 1984 is rapidly emerging as the key book of our age. And another aspect of 1984 is, of course, its sense of geography. If you remember, Britain in 1984 is known as Airstrip 1, because it is part of Oceania, or Oceania, which is really the Anglosphere. It's Britain and America. On the edge, of course, is Eurasia, which is clearly a hugely expanded version of Russia, which has obviously conquered Western Europe, and then beyond it, there's the world of the East and China and whatever, and then below it, the global South, which is the fought over zone below. But what's happened is we used to be part of that world, Oceania. We've increasingly, thanks to Blair, shifted our structures of law and public behavior and the attitude of the state across to the European model. So what we're seeing now, and it's going to be of immense importance in terms of the future for your world, young people like you, we are now seeing a split in the West. The West is splitting absolutely down the line. It used to be splitting along the English Channel. It's now splitting along the Atlantic Sea, the Eastern Atlantic seaboard. America is going America isn't going anywhere. America is remaining what it was. We are shifting to the neo-absolutist state of continental Europe, with all the presumptions of English common law being overlaid, the increasing attack on trial by jury, the whole notion of self-government, all being overlaid by this idea of the expert, of judicial opinion, the regression of parliament. We have, of course, a prime minister who proclaims politics is boring. We were the country that invents politics. We were the country that invented the idea of ruling by debate, because there are at least two sides to every question. It's a warning of how swiftly societies can change. And I think there's a fundamental reason for it. Remember, the reason that we developed all of these things, the reason that the ideas of freedom, of political responsibility, of the rule of law, of the security of property and all the rest of it were pioneered in Britain, in England really, and then enlarged to Britain, was very simple. We had a society, as Edmund Burke describes, of the little platoons in which the idea of self-government penetrated right down to the bottom, with things like juries, with friendly societies, with trade unions. And unfortunately, of course, on the one hand, the increasing centralization of government, so local governmental units get bigger and bigger and bigger, and more professionalized and bureaucratized and more remote from the people that are actually governed. At the same time, the old-fashioned craft unions have collapsed. Unions in the public sector are dominant, but are very large and absolutely politically driven. The structures of bureaucracy and the welfare state take over self-help in every area. So the reason that as it were, it's been so easy to change Britain is that our structures of self-government and self-responsibility had increasingly become a hollowed-out shell. It's like a statue of one of the great heroes of our liberties that you discover is hollow, is made of fiberglass, is breakable.
I want to ask a bit about J.D. Vance very quickly. You mentioned him holidaying in the Cotswolds. Obviously, he hasn't met with Kemi Badenoch, but he did meet with Robert Jenrick. There's something interesting to be said about that. But also, you mentioned the fact that he's holidaying in the Cotswolds, obviously a very nice area of England, beautiful, historic. Can you talk about the history of foreign leaders holidaying in Britain? Did they used to do that? I don't know. In the Tudor times, did the French come over and I guess that holiday?
No, I mean I think you begin you get specific visitors, usually because they've been captured in battle. That's, and they're actually they're actually being ransomed. So we have a king of France, we have distinguished French dukes who are held in the Tower and write about it and have illuminated manuscripts composed. By the end, you get ambassadors, often writing fascinating descriptions, and particularly interesting ones in the later 15th century. You get at the end of the 16th century, with the fame of rulers like Elizabeth, you will get people coming on the equivalent of the Grand Tour, which will take in England. So one of our most interesting accounts is Baron Waldstein, who is, again, you would only come to England generally if you were not a Catholic, because, of course, it's a Protestant country. And Waldstein came from Bohemia, which was one of the states which, before the Battle of the White Mountain in the early 17th century, although it's ruled by the Habsburgs, nevertheless preserves a Protestant religious settlement. And Waldstein comes to England in the I think it's 1599, somewhere around right at the end of Elizabeth's reign anyway, and his itinerary looks exactly like, really, J.D. Vance. He visits Queen, he visits Oxford and Cambridge, he writes, he's shown the Tower, he's told all the lies about the Tower that modern tourists are told about the Tower. He goes ooh-ah at Hampton Court, he's shown the same rooms as J.D. Vance. He admires the extraordinary wealth of the country, because it's then a very rich country, and so on. So yes, I mean, plus ça change. But what's really interesting, really, really interesting, are the sort of visitors who come in the 18th century. People, great Frenchmen. Voltaire, we talked about him at the beginning. Voltaire spends a large chunk of time in England. He's one of the very few Frenchmen at the time who actually speaks English. And do you know what he does? He comes to learn about our politics. And he makes the remark, the English have a single sauce, gravy, but 120 religions, or whatever it is. In other words, the astonishing fact of religious freedom, in contrast with the absolutism of France. Another great Frenchman comes over is Montesquieu, the man who writes De l'Esprit des Lois, the book which invents, it's a bit of nonsense, but it's useful nonsense, the idea of the separation of powers. But Montesquieu comes to England because it is the model for government. In other words, this is the moment at which you were talking about reputation. Our reputation stands as high in the world as possible. We are seen as the model of something that simply did not exist elsewhere, the model of a settled constitution, the model of a responsible freedom, the model of a politics that produces not only freedom, but spectacular prosperity, that doesn't only produce spectacular prosperity, produces amazing literature, noble architecture, the staggering beauty of the country houses and the country parks. London is the first proper planned capital of Europe. We forget this. The remodeling of Paris under Haussmann, under Napoleon III, is directly reflecting the extraordinary reconstruction of London by Nash in the Regency period. All of this, we were the pioneers. We are the first people to industrialize, the first time to have properly paved streets, the first time that you've got proper illuminations with gas and so on. And Stephen, we've thrown it away. And that's why J.D. Vance chastises us, in my view, correctly, out of a kind of lament. There are other aspects that I think it's worth raising on the kind of company. You mentioned the obvious company that is speaking, keeping Robert Jenrick and whatever. Some of the more interesting, I think, is, again, reflecting one of the very important differences between Britain and America, which is the importance of church-going. So the people that are guiding Vance are people like James Orr, Danny Kruger, and so on, who are those who believe in the vital importance of a Christian revival in producing a conservative revival. And indeed, it's religion which seems to be the only real point of contact between Vance and our preposterous Foreign Secretary. I mean, one of the more implausible friendships that one, that one can possibly imagine. And I think that again is a growing point of difference and distinction. I mean, I myself remain profoundly unconvinced by the idea that our political culture, as so many people have argued, Tom Holland in particular, is founded on so-called Judeo-Christian values. If you actually look at the American Constitution, I think, even with the Declaration of Independence, God is mentioned once, and it's in purely rhetorical terms. Everything else is derived from the classical world. It's derived from Greece and Rome, which is why, of course, you're there in DC, why DC is this extraordinary revivalist city of classical architecture, and why, interestingly, of course, our favorite president, Donald Trump, as well as covering everything in gold, has decided that everything should be built in the classical style. So we're going to see new federal buildings in DC. I gather the first, very appropriately, is going to be the new IRS. And the present IRS, which, as you know, is that decaying monster of the 1960s, is going to be knocked down, and some glowing white marble structure, looking vaguely fascistic, vaguely Mussolini-ish, is going to go in it, or indeed Speerish is going to go in its place.
I want to end the interview by talking about Donald Trump. This is a topic we've touched on before, but I think it's interesting to come back to. The same arguments are still being made that Putin is Hitler, that Trump is appeasing him, and so on. Obviously, the Ukraine war has been going on for some years now. What do you make of this latest summit? And do you think that we should essentially say, look, Putin can have the lands in the east of Ukraine, Ukraine shouldn't join NATO, but this war needs to end?
I don't think we've got much choice, do we? I mean, it's very simple. Unless we decide we want to wage more or less all-out war, one is not going to change anything. And again, I think the whole antics of the beginning of the war, so much of it is fought on. Again, it's fought with words. Remember, the idea of let's just take a very typical remark that people will make. The idea that the Ukraine should recognize the Russian takeover of the Crimea, and which was done in 2015, that it should recognize and, as it were, peacefully. In any case, it had only been added to the Ukraine by Khrushchev, and at the same time hand over the Donbass and the other provinces in the east of the Ukraine. And the characteristic remark will be, oh, well, you're a Brit. Which one of your counties would you hand over? Will you hand over Westmoreland? You were born in Westmoreland. Can I gently point out that even Westmoreland, as remote as it is from London, has been part of a recognisable kingdom of England for 1,000 years. The Ukraine is, as an independent, as quasi-independent state, a thing of what, 30 years existence, as even a nominally independent state is only forged in 1945. The reason for that was that Stalin wanted an extra vote in the United Nations. That in other words, the relationship between the Ukraine and Russia is almost that of England and Scotland. That's to say, but except over a much longer period of time. Scotland had an entirely separate existence as a kingdom with its own structure, its own laws, all of which were preserved in 1707. But then equally extraordinary close proximity of language, use of similar alphabet, religious style, and so on. So you're dealing there, what we're dealing with is the business of the final disintegration of empires. The idea that there are kind of nation states bursting naturally to get out of them. It is the enormous problem of the myth that we imposed on the world, again, Anglo-American myth that we imposed on the world in 1945, the natural nature of self-determination, the idea that all people have got the right to govern themselves, that all frontiers should be fixed and stable. These are myths. They're myths. What's going on in the Ukraine at the moment is, again, a very interesting phenomenon. Are you familiar with the idea of ethnogenesis?
No.
Ethnogenesis means the birth of a nation. And nations can actually be born or reborn, killed and grow again. Poland is a very interesting example of that repeated process. And what's going on in the Ukraine at the moment is maybe successful, maybe not, the attempted invention of a separate nation. Remember, Zelensky's first language is Russian, as it is of much of the Ukrainian elite. When Khrushchev added the Crimea to the Ukraine, he did so deliberately to increase the number of Russian speakers. So what you're seeing at the moment is the ethnogenesis, in which you try to invent a people, to give them a new history, a laundered up and tidied history. There's this intensely disputed history. There's a Ukrainian version of the history of Russia, and there is the federal Russian, the version that's put forward by Putin. Again, there is the dispute as to two languages. You're seeing all sorts of things on the eastern side of the Ukraine, in which everybody's going on about genocide, about Ukrainian orphan children being given to Russian families. I think a very similar process of alteration of language and enforcement of a single language is actually going on the Ukrainian side, even as in the England of Henry VIII. You've actually split recently from the Patriarchate of Moscow, just as England broke with Rome, and you set up another patriarch in Kiev and so on. So you're in what's going on with Zelensky. He is part of the process of inventing a nation in blood and iron and suffering, as these things are usually done. And do you know what? It's being done with what? Toxic masculinity. We are giving the Ukrainians the right to enforce their own ethnic identity. We are saying they've got the right to stop their frontiers being invaded. How does this connect with our earlier conversation? We've decided here that it's an utterly wicked thing to talk about ethno-nationalism. How can we say that an Englishman has got more right to be here than, because we believe in universal human rights, don't we? How can we say we should defend the frontier? And how, above all, Stephen, could we ask our troops to defend their right to ethnic identity, their right to frontiers, when we don't do it at home? This is the complete lunacy that that Western Europe has got itself into, as well, of course, as not having the weapons to do it at all. So you've tried to fight the war with words. You see, again, we're going back to dear Fraser Nelson. All of these people believe in the power of words. They believe in the magic of words. Can you imagine? One of the first things these people have done? Why is Putin being met in Alaska? He's being met in Alaska for the simple reason you couldn't meet on neutral territory because, of course, the West, us, have referred Putin to the International Criminal Court. So there will be likelihood of his being, a possibility, very remote in my view, of his being arrested, because we believe in the power of words. We actually believe that he will quake at an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court. You know, the sheer pervasive vanity, extraordinary vanity, B, stupidity. And again, there's something else. Our enormous concern, and Stephen, I find this really interesting, we can do nothing about the Ukraine. We've got an army, our entire army would fit inside one battalion of the Russian army, or indeed the Ukrainian army, or indeed the Polish army. We have no military strength left at all. Okay, we've atom bombs, allegedly. What sort of repair they're in, I imagine they're in much the same state of repair as the rest of the public sector. But we think in our vanity. You issue a statement. A statement, our Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, sitting in the desk of Palmerston, says we. Now, Palmerston had gunboats. Palmerston had the largest navy in the world. He'd the richest country, the most powerful bank. Yes, Palmerston could tell people what to do. We can't. And we look fools when we do it. Again, the same is absolutely true in Gaza and with Israel. We can do nothing. Now, again, the great 19th century understood this perfectly. There's, again, these extraordinary processions of people in London, and people willing to go to jail, with the whole business, Palestine Action and all the rest of it. For what? For things they can do nothing about. Dickens has this marvelous thing. He talks about telescopic charity. The further something is away, the absolutely less you can do about it, the more excited you get. And he's got this wonderful character, Mrs. Jellyby. His names are always wonderful. Mrs. Jellyby in Bleak House, who spends all her time, believe it or not, this is back in the mid-19th century, worrying about Africa. Worrying about the state of Africans. So are they properly clad? Are they a bit like Bill Gates, worrying desperately about Africa, whilst her entire family is in a state of ruin, her own children, the filthy household disorganized and everything, but she cares about Africa. We are in that same state. We suffer from telescopic charity. But we believe, even more stupidly, Mrs. Jellyby was only interested in charity. We believe that we carry influence, we carry weight. Again, so much of the nonsense about global warming, our infinite self-destructiveness in aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050 is apparently we are a net zero superpower. Apparently, the rest of the world goes, oh, isn't Britain amazing? Okay, you may be at risk of getting stabbed on the streets of London or your nice Rolex switched off, but Britain is a net zero superpower. Aren't we filled with respect? And do you know what the rest of the world does? It says, what mugs? What mugs? But unfortunately, we are ruled by people who believe in this stuff. This is what is the message of the Labour Party. The Labour Party has no purpose but for this stuff. It's perfectly clear. It has no solution, no domestic solution whatever. But Keir Starmer is a human rights lawyer. The Attorney General, Richard Hermer, is an international lawyer. They believe in these myths. And the myths have real consequences. We are bankrupting ourselves for net zero. And it's been revealed, do you know how much money we are actually paying now to pay wind farms in Scotland not to generate fuel? We're paying getting on for £1 billion a year. Can you imagine it? Not generate electricity. It's completely demented. We are at every stage guilty of these absurd and preposterous myths. I think it goes even further. Of course, we're giving away the Chagos Islands at a figure now which looks like £35 billion. But at the same time, we are effectively on the point of bankruptcy. The lunacy of this, it is genuinely lunatic. But Stephen, all of these things intermesh. The whole business of transgenderism. Again, it's the belief in the magic of words. Again, Rachel Reeves saying, oh, growth is my first priority. And what does she do? Slap a tax on jobs. There's a genuine, do you see what I mean? There is a genuine derangement. It's as mad as that poor man on the District Line train with his trousers down.
David, this was a fantastic interview. I really, really appreciate it. I think you're so right about Charles Dickens. What a prescient writer. And you made some incredible points, and you really got me thinking today. So I appreciate you coming on yet again.
Of fun, as always.